Record on the clock. Great. Well, thanks for joining us today. My name is James Searle. I'm here to welcome you guys to the first of the conversations that we're having under the heading of meeting places. This event is co-sponsored by the English department at the University of Albany, so we thank them for their support. Like I said before, we're recording today, so please make sure to keep yourself muted up until the question and answer session today. Once we get there, we're going to use the raise hand function to get in the queue to ask questions and kind of dive into the conversation. We have 2 more sessions coming, and we hope to see all of you there. The next one is happening on April the 14th, and it will be focused on literary criticism. It's called Literature as Equipment for Living. And we'll have another conversation on April the 28th called Tales Tall and Otherwise, the Uses of Stories. So today we're opening up the Meeting Places event, and I'm joined by Raquel Velho and Devin Short. We're going to have a conversation. They're really going to have a conversation. We'll dig in later on infrastructures. I'm going to ask Raquel and Devin a series of questions that are intended to foster and guide the conversation. I'm going to do my very best to stay out of their way, and if a good back and forth gets underway, I'll be quiet, and if things go off track, I'll sort of intervene. So I'm here to sort of facilitate the conversation. The more formal conversation will take up, say, the first half of our time, and it'll be followed by kind of questions from the floor. So I want you guys all to dig in. One of the orienting ideas for the Meeting Places series is that conversations, arguments, and dialogues play a central but largely invisible role in intellectual work, and that the academy today suffers from a lack of sustained and sustaining meeting places where conversations can begin and develop. Because conversations are more informal, idiosyncratic, and open-ended than conventional kinds of academic presentations, our hope today is that we will end up somewhere unexpected and or learn or discover something genuinely new. I'm going to briefly introduce our participants before we get the conversation started. So first, it's my pleasure to welcome Raquel, who is an assistant professor at the Department of Science and Technology Studies at Rensselaer Polytechnic Institute. She's a sociologist of infrastructures, and her work focuses on the development of large socio-technical systems and how they shape our lives, while simultaneously highlighting the transformative practices of marginalized users. She received her PhD in Science and Technology Studies from the University College London in the UK. And I'm quite happy to announce that her forthcoming book, Hacking the Underground, will be coming sometime in winter 23-24 from the University of Washington Press under their feminist techno science series. Yes, good, I said it right. So that's Raquel. Raquel will be joined by Devin. Devin is a PhD candidate in history at the University of Washington, where he studies the development of computer models in US climate science. Devin began his career in physics, earning a master's degree specializing in nuclear science experiments with low energy particle accelerators. He switched fields to better understand how scientific knowledge about climate change is created and how it might benefit people adapting to life in a warming world. He is currently developing a database that provides new methods for investigators to explore the complex archives people create when they work in distributed collaborations like modern scientific communities. Just want to make sure that everybody remembers to stay muted for the first part of this, unless your name is Raquel or Devin, just so we've got everything flowing. So with that, I'm going to start the conversation, and I think I'll start with you, Raquel, and the question will then go to Devin. How did you come to infrastructure as a key aspect of your own research and teaching, Raquel?
Hi, everybody. James, thanks so much for the invitation and for creating, alongside Leroy and so many others, the space that is Tautogori. Number one, I'm really excited to just chat with Devin and then with everybody else, largely because I agree there is a lack of space. For number one, coming from the background of sociology, which I'll come back to in a second, I'm so used to coming to these things and getting stressed out about preparing a PowerPoint presentation and just making sure I have something that's like really nailed and polished. And this is just really wonderful to know that we can just riff off a lot of ideas and have that help develop some further ideas. Infrastructures is something that I actually took a while to kind of realize that I was working on. I think when I was writing my PhD in STS at UCL, I kind of just saw the work that I was doing as sociology, pretty straightforward, like sociology of technology. And I remember early on, my advisor, Brian Balmer, who's an incredible social historian on warfare and secrecy and warfare, he actually asked me the question pretty explicitly, like, how is my work like not just sociology? How is my work actually STS? And I remember that being the first time that I was made to have to contend with what is the field of science and technology studies, like how do we draw these boundaries around disciplines and what are they for? And he was also the person who introduced me to the work of Susan Lee Starr. He actually didn't assign it in class. It was in having conversations in class about public transportation. I was still in my master's degree. I was talking about public transportation and disability, and he said something along the lines of, you know, it's really interesting because STS doesn't talk about disability very much, but I remember this one article or even like chapter in an edited collection by Susan Lee Starr, where she talks about her allergy to onions as being this like this fascinating relationship with fast food, particularly with McDonald's, and how the standardization processes of infrastructures and socio-technical systems kind of create distinctive relationships for different people that perhaps don't fit what is understood as the standard user or the imagined user, right? And with onion allergies being so difficult, every time Lee Starr would ask for a hamburger at McDonald's, she would have to ask for onions to not be on it. And then it would take like 30 minutes for the burger to be done, which kind of defeats the purpose of going to McDonald's in the first place. And she reflects on this beautifully in this article that is literally called On Being Allergic to Onions. That's the subtitle of that article. And that article stayed with me to such an extent that I cited significantly in my thesis. My examiners requested that I remove at least 2 mentions of the burger story from my thesis. And when I was doing my revisions, I responded to them categorically will not remove these mentions, because I thought it was such an important part of the story. Because I came to realize my entire story is about misfitting with infrastructures. And it's that process of misfitting that is so beautifully, even if in sometimes silly ways, illustrated by the burger story, that it just translated perfectly to analogies around disability and transportation. How do wheelchair users use public transportation? It's just that simple question that guided my work. And it took coming to getting a tenure track position and being forced to write a book, and I say forced very like in a very selective way there, that I was like, okay, who am I actually in conversations with? And figuring out that infrastructure studies has become this little subfield within STS, but also way outside of STS, like anthropologists and geographers and historians that have been working on this topic as well, that I came to kind of embrace it as my area. And I now call myself a sociologist of infrastructures because of that. And it really wouldn't have happened at all if it weren't for the work of Lee Starr. So I really kind of have carried that as like a genealogy of my work in infrastructures, is like through Brian Balmer introducing me to Lee Starr, he effectively changed the course, I think, of my career. I think it would have been something very different if he had allowed me to just do like what I wanted to do, which was a history of prosthetics. And he was like, yeah, history of prosthetics, maybe. Hey, here's like this weird bunch of literature, try this out for size. And I was like, yeah, I'm sold. So that's how I ended up in infrastructure studies.
Great. Devin, I assume it wasn't Lee Starr who got you. I know Lee Starr is important. Tell us a bit about how you came to infrastructures and what you're doing with infrastructure.
Yeah, I worked in nuclear physics for almost 10 years. And I left specifically so I could look at climate science and climate change. And so there were two things that were sort of surprising to me about this. One was just the cultural shift. I mean, so I understood that there would be kind of a substantial difference between, you know, the environments I was working in the sciences and what I would see in a history department. But it was still very surprising to me the extent to which people in history departments work alone and are like pretty substantially resistant to the idea that they would work with other people in some cases. Which is one of the reasons I'm you know, pretty happy to be participating in conversations like this, because I see that as sort of this kind of significant problem, and this leads to then some misunderstanding in some cases about how kind of historians and social scientists studying physical science kind of understand how this history fits together and how these communities work, because people who are social scientists or social scholars of science, I guess, frequently kind of have this disconnect. And so in that, you know, if anyone has read a major work about like the STS kind of angles on climate modeling in particular, it's going to be Paul Edwards's A Vast Machine. It was a book from 2011. And that takes a very particular position about knowledge infrastructures and the development of climate data and computer systems around meteorology and climate science. And that was sort of a moment of me kind of like stepping back and saying, okay, I don't, you know, this is my first encounter with, you know, pretty heavy STS theory and things like this. And so I had to really spend some time on it. And I think, you know, this is one of those books that as like a first-year graduate student was very, you know, had that classic early grad student, like, I hate this, here's all of the problems with what's going on here. And it took me probably 2 years of, you know, going back and forth with other things and sort of circling back to Vast Machine many times to kind of get a much clearer understanding of what Edwards is doing in the book and really the situation that he was in when he started doing the work, which is that there was basically nothing else that had been written about this outside of scientific circles. And so I was kind of shoehorned into looking at infrastructures. And the thing that I've come to in the work that I'm doing now, and we'll get into this about like sort of using the idea of infrastructures in my own work is kind of complicated, but the thing that I'm really very cognizant of now is that in the work that I did in the sciences, I had the advantage of really, really complicated infrastructures, right? So an accelerator facility has multiple or one that's a user facility. So I worked at Triumph, which is Canada's national lab for nuclear and particle physics. And that's what's called a user facility, where they have this big accelerator and people all over the world will apply for time to use it and do different kinds of experiments. And so that relies on, I think, very obviously all kinds of different infrastructures. And there's a complicated organizational structure inside the laboratory. There are different regulatory bodies involved, different institutions. And so that was sort of obvious to me. And like one of the reasons I moved over is because it was really clear that like the supply chains that make these things work probably can't survive really radical climate change. And that was kind of, present in my mind as I was thinking about changing disciplines. But now that I've been thinking about infrastructures more significantly and doing this database project, it's really clear to me that the historians just don't have any kind of infrastructure they can rely on. So there's no social, technical, physical, like there's no infrastructure, right? I don't have an office if I don't currently have an appointment in my department. There's no place that I can go that sort of anchors my presence in the history department at the University of Washington. So there's just this like fundamental gap in the practical work of doing history, as far as I'm concerned. And this database project that I came to, there's this guy, Jim Fleming, who sort of started the history of meteorology. I had a conversation with him about 4 years ago now. And I was like, look, this is the project I want to do. I want to do this thing with a citation network and do a lot of sort of network analyses of scientific literature in this area. This is what I would need to do that. And Jim is like, don't do that. This is going to take too long. It's bigger than a dissertation project. And he was sort of right and wrong in that. And what I wound up doing is developing a piece of software that I can use to do these analyses. And had I had this piece of software when I started, I would have been able to do the analysis that I wanted to do. And so I've kind of come to think about this a little bit as like a potential place where people could start building infrastructure to do the kind of history that I do, where they could share some of these activities, they could share common work and products that they produce together, and these things could persist over time and become kind of embedded in some of these things that we produce as research products. And so that's kind of the role of infrastructure for me in my thinking and scholarship now, is really sort of grappling with the fact that there isn't an infrastructure that I can stand on to do the things that I want to do, and thinking about how maybe people could be addressing that problem.
Beautiful. I already know, hopefully we'll get lucky and there'll be an argument, but it doesn't have to be a nasty one. This sort of leads me to want to ask, and I guess I'll throw it back to you, Raquel, but feel free to intervene with one another. One thing that's obvious in both of what you've sort of said is that infrastructures enable, they mediate, they also constrain distinctive kinds of intellectual and practical agency, but they're really, really difficult for people to see, acknowledge, and change. So I was wondering if you guys could just talk about, what do you think accounts for the difficulty people have in either seeing something as an infrastructure or seeing that they don't have an infrastructure? That is, there seems to be, a perceptual or intellectual problem here where people are happy to talk about infrastructure as roads and bridges, but anything beyond that seems to sort of fall away immediately, where we're all sort of floating at sea. Devin, you've got a really nice example where you literally didn't have an infrastructure, you had to start making one to do the work you wanted to do. But Raquel, too, you've written a lot about how existing infrastructures have a really complicated history that enable and constrain. So I wanted to put that on the table for you guys to talk about.
Yeah, so in terms of like what I think what is one of the difficulties is we're very comfortable And here I know I'm using a royal we. I don't exactly know what that royal we is referring to, and I'll be upfront about that. I don't know if it's we as in general populations or if it's we and STS have a tendency of talking about these infrastructures, all infrastructures, as though they, and the metaphor that's used repeatedly in STS is as though they were invisible, right? Now there are people in STS that like being a little belligerent around that and say like, obviously infrastructure is visible because light hits it. So of course you can see cables. And it's like, well, right, that's also just not what the metaphor is trying to do. It's trying to talk about mundanity, right? It's trying to talk about day-to-day things that you don't really think about. And one of the things that I'm trying to trace in this book is how effectively this has a lot to do with experience, and this has a lot to do with relations. So if an infrastructure is, and I'm going to use Heidegger here, if an infrastructure is ready to hand, if an infrastructure is easy to use, and you don't have to think about it, it sinks into the background of your life. That's pretty simple for everybody to think about. When we wake up in the morning, we open our laptops. If you're at home, you're pretty easily connected to the Wi-Fi. Things just kind of seem to be done as though by magic. And I think that makes it very difficult for people day to day to really think about all of the interconnections, all of the materiality that's really enabling all of this work to actually be done. So a big part of the question is, well, that's a good thing. Like infrastructures should be sinking into the background, because having to think about all of the connections that you do have to make electricity work in your house, to make plumbing work in your house, I mean, it's endless. We would be back to doing that as full-time jobs, right? This is like an equivalent to pretty significant homesteading. You have a pump in your backyard for you to go and get water. You have candlelight. You need to like actually gauge for all of these things in your daily practices. And when we have functioning infrastructure, that gets to kind of evaporate. That said, as we can also very clearly see, this is not the case for everybody. So we can talk about the digital divide, how like having higher income means that you're more easily connected to the internet, or if you're not disabled, you can more easily access public transportation, or even just thinking about water crises. I mean, Philadelphia is going through one right now with latex that has gone into the river, or Flint hasn't had functioning water infrastructure for a very long time. So when we're talking about invisibility, I feel like one of the things that STSers have wanted to do now is say the invisible to whom, right? So it is ultimately a question of relationality and positionality and with regards to the infrastructure. I think that makes it really difficult to grasp, because I think that the l'homme moyen, as like would be the average man here, doesn't effectively have to negotiate with a lot of the ins and outs of infrastructure. And often it is the average man that is kind of creating these infrastructures without regards to marginalized or differentiated or minoritized bodies. So that's one of the complications. The other complication, I think, is scalar. I think it's very difficult to talk about infrastructure because we're trying to deal with the hyper local, like the specific points of mediation and interaction, an interface specifically between a person and the infrastructure. But also when we talk about infrastructure, and this is something that Lee Starr and Karen Roulater have told us since 1996, it's always scoped out, right? So infrastructure doesn't just happen in one location. It is always in various other places. This is partly what makes it an infrastructure, is that it is connecting and bridging so many people and things and artifacts. So how do we create analytical tools that are able to account for all of these scales? Paul Edwards, that Devin has already mentioned, has a fantastic and also problematic article in other points. That's a book chapter from 2003 called Infrastructures and Modernity. And this is one of the key things that he talks about in that article, is how slippery infrastructure is because it is multiscalar. And he proposes a multiscalar analysis in that article through infrastructure studies, which I think connects really well with some of Devin's points, because one of the things that Paul is talking about in that article is that doing this work by yourself, like researching in an infrastructure in earnest and trying to understand all of its layers, all of its scales, all of its implications, all of the people who use it, all of the people who have developed it, is not a task for a single person. It is so difficult to do that type of rigorous historical and sociological analysis that you want to develop research teams for this. You should want to do that. And we need like academic infrastructures then that enable that type of research project as well. So I think those are the two things that are going there, right? It sinks into the background and it's multi-scalar. So of course, we're going to like have to come to terms with all of that slipperiness to be able to really research it.
Devin, get in there. That seems like just a nice, slow, good pitch for you.
Yeah, I mean, so if I think if the question is like, do we have to deal with infrastructure? I mean, I think sort of obviously yes, right? That if for no other reason than, as Raquel is saying, that the infrastructure in the United States, especially, is just decaying in place. That there's no, you know, so I moved to Vancouver for my master's degree in Vancouver, BC, and the first summer I was there, I was like, there is road work all the time. Like I cannot get across town. And my dad at one point when he was visiting made this comment about like, yeah, it's almost like they sort of maintain their water infrastructure, right? That like they're actually replacing water mains. And so that is one aspect of this. I mean, I of course am going to go immediately to the fact that like climate change also means that, you know, like California is a great example this year, but it's just been constant over and over and over. There just hasn't been a break in the last, you know, couple of months in terms of weather systems that have just knocked out infrastructure really critically. And so that now becomes the norm as opposed to sort of these moments where somebody like Edwards would say that like they become visible when they fail, infrastructures do. I think now it's just sort of ever present in a lot of ways. I then struggle in some ways to sort of abstract this out in a couple of different ways. One of them is that I think in conversation, infrastructure is a really, really helpful metaphor, or whatever you want to call it, really, really helpful term, because people immediately, if they're at all familiar with the word, immediately associate it with something like electrical grids or plumbing or something like that, because that's how it's used in common language. And I think that's a really productive metaphor. I found it very, very helpful. In my writing, I really struggled to make it precise enough to be productive. And in most cases, what I have found, so Raquel had that really productive phrase from Heidegger that's ready to hand. There's an analogous term in philosophy of modeling right now from somebody named Wendy Parker that is fitness for purpose. And there's a lot of argument back and forth from various different people about what actually gets done when you do something like climate modeling. And there's some more kind of, I don't want to say traditional, but there's some more conservative philosophy about what sort of epistemologically happens when you run a climate model. And Parker takes a slightly different tack, which is to say that whatever climate models do, the thing that they do is fit for the purpose people want to use them for. And I think in a lot of ways that lines up quite well with the discussion or the points Raquel is making, because obviously if I'm in, say, a wheelchair when I'm using a bus, my purpose might be similar to what other people are, or to other people's purposes, but you know, my kind of initial position or the practical things that I need to get my transportation done, whichever term you want to use there, is different than other people's. And so something can be fit for purpose there, but then you run into all of these problems about whose purpose again. So typically, and I think I sent a message to James and Raquel a little recently about, like, in editing something for a section of my dissertation, I had mentioned infrastructure several times and got stuck in these loops about how do I actually handle this. And I realized that the best way to deal with it was to just get rid of the discussion of infrastructure and say specifically what practical and purposeful items people are actually handling in that moment. Because, you know, for my purpose in that moment, this idea of infrastructure just becomes too unwieldy, and I have to handle too many cases that somebody reading this might come at that passage with. And so I think, and I think this also again has to do with my background in like very practical laboratory science, where if I want to mention infrastructure, then I have a really particular thing that I'm going to do, and I feel like if I am going to put it out there, I need to kind of back out all of the different things somebody is going to criticize it for. And generally, when I do that, I get to a point where there's just too many different versions of it, and I kind of drop it out. So I think the constraints for me are just like, I have a hard time finding out what they are in terms of in my writing. But I think there's this very different thing that happens when we're discussing this stuff. And so in conversations like this, I think infrastructure is this great, really useful tool. And I still don't know in my scholarship how it works in the actual kind of research products that I come to.
Beautiful.
Can I just jump in there? Because
Yeah.
that's really good. So I was just thinking about how would I define infrastructures, and thinking about, and of course, everything right now is very book-based. So I think about like, how have I done this in the book? And oftentimes I realize I just don't do it. I don't tackle the thorny task of defining what an infrastructure is. I kind of accept that kind of like Potter Stewart approach to pornography here, which is like, I know it when I see it. And it's just kind of like, yeah, it's really difficult to define at what point. And this is an argument that I feel like I could potentially get tangled into the weeds about. So Thomas P. Hughes, the historian of technology, and writing about sociotechnical systems, he kind of has this like layered argument that systems are collections of networks, and then like does that kind of scaffolding of attempting to show these things as like scalar, right? He doesn't, Hughes himself, though a lot of people credit him as being really myself included, as being the beginning of infrastructure studies, doesn't really articulate or develop the concept of infrastructures himself. He really talks about systems, and he really talks of sociotechnical systems. That really is his turn there. I have ended up just using sociotechnical systems and networks and infrastructures all to mean the same thing. I realize that this is probably, like being fully honest, like probably poor academically speaking, but I just don't see especially in my case where I'm talking so clearly about something that is visible and like understood as an infrastructure, right? Public transit, like people readily accept this as an infrastructure. I have found that I don't need to spend a lot of time doing that. But I agree, like sometimes I wonder how productive it is to use the term infrastructure. And Devin, I know you and I have had a back and forth in this in the past around like, well, is language an infrastructure, and what does language enable or disable in being considered like an infrastructure in and of itself? Like we can get into fisticuffs about it, I think, but I don't know how productive that would be too.
Yeah, no, I think so. This is a really good distinction, because I totally agree with you that if you're writing about, you know, bus networks in London, infrastructure is exactly where you should be going, right? That makes complete sense. The thing is that when I run into infrastructure and the stuff that I'm doing, it's always knowledge infrastructures,
Yeah.
because that's the tone that's been set, and that's where I really have a lot of difficulty. And you know, the criticism of Edwards's approach there that I have is that he does a lot of loading into this issue of like, so there's a knowledge infrastructure for weather data in his sort of evaluation, and what people do is invert the infrastructure to sort of do science. And if you're interested in finding out what scientists do, this leads you down a lot of paths that don't work. And I don't think he's interested in really finding out what scientists do day to day in that book. I think he has a lot of other goals. But this issue of infrastructural inversion is, you know, we don't need to get lost in the weeds on this, because people have like very different ideas about what that means. But I think the problem with defining infrastructure is that it becomes necessary when you say knowledge infrastructure, in my mind, that like that requires a lot of specificity. And I then sort of become very uneasy with where the analogy to the physical infrastructure comes in, because no matter what, if you're going to use the word infrastructure in some context, there's an immediate practical analogy to power grids and plumbing and transportation. Yeah. And so that's the immediate thing that has to be handled in that analysis. And sort of, I'm sure that there are, like Laystar, for instance, talks about information technology in libraries and life sciences. And she does that extremely eloquently. And I think very, very appropriately, because then again, there's this like really precise network of things that you're actually dealing with. And people have, you know, they go to a terminal, they'll enter data, they'll download things from an API. Like there's very practical activities that people do when they're dealing with that kind of knowledge infrastructure. Edwards then runs into this scaling problem of like, I'm going to talk about a global data infrastructure that then also comes somehow people interact with in their offices, and that then becomes too unwieldy in my mind. And so I think you're right that the scaling issue is what winds up being most present in my mind. But when you're in writing and you have this metaphor that starts to get that unwieldy, I just sort of like, yeah, I think there's sort of conversational pieces and not, and like I'm writing a dissertation and not a book. And so like, there's all kinds of things that I'm not interested in doing in a dissertation that I might be if I were writing a book.
Yeah, and it's interesting too. So I have Caroline Mason is a graduate student in our department that I'm working with, and she's working on the World Digital Library. That was a project developed by UNESCO in partnership with the Library of Congress. So in that case, she's very comfortable using, and she talks about infrastructural inversion, like specifically because she's studying the metadata that the Library of Congress uses for the organization of what is considered to be world heritage, right? And this is the project of the World Digital Library, is this collection of world heritage documents from around the world. And Caroline interviewed people in Uganda that participated in this. And like what the Library of Congress defines as world heritage versus what the Ugandan contributors wanted to have included as their world heritage ended up being in conflict there. So I can see where like a project that uses that uses knowledge infrastructures to speak about these very particular projects with very specific tendrils and associations becomes a little bit clearer than when you're doing this type of, you know, multi-scalar work. And I've been trying to work this through as well, because my second project is on what I'm calling research infrastructures. And I want to name that as research infrastructures to not fall trap to information infrastructures, right? So I'm thinking here about astronomical observatories, where they're set up and their relationship with local populations. So I'm really trying to think about like a bricks and mortar approach to research infrastructures and their situatedness. So I'm trying to differentiate that, but a lot of colleagues that I've been in conversation with have been telling me, like, I am so sorry, you're not going to be able to do that without talking about information infrastructures, because so much of the data that is created in these locations then gets sent to other places through ostensibly what is now understood in STS as information infrastructure. So I'm like, no, can I call it something else? Can I just call it data infrastructure and deal with it differently? Like, so that's something that I'm trying to contend with at the moment as well.
Well, but I mean, the alternative there is to say, like, no, I'm dealing with the internet and the World Wide Web as two different actual specific objects, right? which, you know, you don't have to do. I don't know what kind of analysis you're doing, but this issue of metadata specifically is really, really important. And the database system that I wound up designing, what I've done is come up with a way for people to do data entry. So sit down, type out information that they need for some kind of a project. And there's a set of scripts that will generate a database ontology for them. And so we can get into sort of what some of those things mean if people want. But the point there is that in this system, or in this approach to these things, what somebody does is figure out how to enter certain data, and then they have a system that generates a metadata architecture for them.
Oh, cool.
That then is compatible with other things, right? So if you actually focus on the labor people do, like the specific labor that has to get done to get information from somewhere in the world into a computer, you actually obviate a bunch of these problems of discussing, like, what does it mean to have a database ontology? Whose infrastructure works with whose? If you sort of do that, again, that bricks and mortar approach, right? Looking at, like, what does somebody have to do if they're going to go into their office and figure out how to get this data to the place it needs to go and do the analyses they want to do. If you start focusing on those things, I think there's a lot of very productive stuff that can happen, both for people who need to use those systems and for us as people who are kind of studying people who use those systems.
Yeah.
Cool. Leroy has raised his hand. He's completely out of order, but I'm happy to let him intervene if it's cool with Raquel and Devin. It's cool. So Leroy, you need to unmute yourself.
Does that work? Okay. There are two things that strike me from these presentations. I mean, you're raising questions of extraordinary importance, and they're very complicated. You know, and one of the fundamental things about this is that, you know, when Raquel's point and Devin has indicated something similar, that much of infrastructure is invisible. But there's also a lot of it that is very, very visible. You know, and then the mode in which we might see it, or have some way of providing an analysis of it, is not altogether clear. You know, particularly because this question is coming up, because there's so many parts of the infrastructure that we can actually see. We see how they work, and then we're acutely aware of when they're coming apart and when they're failing. You know, and the difficulty in this respect is that there's so much that is visible. The buildings that get built, the budgets that are in place, the people who've been hired. You know, at previous conversation, not on the record here. You know, talking with Devin, as a matter of fact, says, well, one can't do interdisciplinary research alone, you know, but also if you're going to deal with something where you have to have the resources of an infrastructure, that means many, many connections. Some of them are local, some of them are virtual, some of them are purely intellectual. It has to be maintained. You know, and so the visible structures that are there, sometimes the buildings, you know, now those of you who have been in conversation, you know, you know how tiresome I can be about this. But what has happened, you know, is that with the shift of research away from, you know, government labs, business laboratories, you know, and there are so many that are just gone. That it's shifted to the university with tremendous impact. The University of Washington in the last biennium built 7 brand new buildings at enormous cost, violating all sorts of conventions about how the land on the campus would be used. And in those 7 you know, research buildings that they built in the 2-year period, there are, by my count, only 3 classrooms that have been added. You know, there are almost no discussion rooms. If you want to have a meeting for a space to talk to somebody, good luck. Go to someplace else besides the University of Washington, because all of the rooms, the janitor's closets, have been turned into rooms to house the science operations. Now, that's very visible. But what's visible in another way is that we are confronting with this very question, two questions at least that we don't always see or don't see clearly. One is that we have great uncertainty at the moment, at least so it seems to me, in trying to decide what will constitute good work. And that has always required reference to the infrastructure. If you put it in a context of the rather sketchy and not altogether satisfying discussion of John Guillory in Professing Criticism, the distinction between a profession and a discipline. If you're concerned with a profession, you have to interact with an infrastructure that means your articles will get published, they will be put in libraries, somebody can find out what you were doing. Now, I don't think this is just a peculiarity of my own professional career, but probably 2/3 of the things that I've published, there's not any way you could even get hold of them. One of them has only appeared in Turkish. There's one that's only in Russian. There are many of them that are not in publications that are available in any library I've ever seen. And that's a minor problem. But when you say, what is the work we actually do? That concerns the discipline. And it's not the same.
Leroy, I'm gonna jump in here. I'm gonna pause you.
One point. If we don't have some way to decide what is good work, then all of the things about infrastructure that must be made visible remain invisible. Okay,
good. I think there's probably about 7 questions we could all find in there that are quite good. Is there something immediate that you guys have? Raquel, go ahead.
I have 3 things immediately, but I'll say the one that was like the number one thing that came to my mind was a question of methodology. And I think that part of making things visible is a choice of methodology. So Leroy, when you're talking about, for example, the visibility of buildings, right? And the development of these buildings at the University of Washington. I mean, we've seen the same thing at Rensselaer. We've had MPAC and ECAV, which should be a pointer to see how Rensselaer just loves its acronyms. But both of these things do not have classrooms. ECAV stands for the East Campus Athletic Village. MPAC is the Experimental Media and Performance Arts Center. And the note that you make about how obvious it is that these places don't enable meeting spaces or don't enable classroom spaces. My response to that is, yes, that's immediately apparent to somebody like yourself, right? My guess is to somebody like administrators that are working from their very particular situations within the infrastructure that is higher education, or specifically the infrastructures of RPI and of UW, like that's not things that they're concerned with. Though arguably we would say they should be, because we're doing the business in the classroom, right, as it were. So for us, that is immediately apparent. And this is one of the things that I think is so difficult about working on infrastructures. And Susan Lee Starr, again, has like a wonderful phrase to capture this, which is that somebody's infrastructure is another person's brick wall. And it's just one of those things where it has everything to do with situation within the infrastructure. So for instructors that have been feeling the squeeze in terms of not just like, we can start talking about all of the infrastructures of academia here, but talking about like the gentrification of higher education, the rising number of students in classrooms, the lack of meeting spaces like this one where we're really conversing and not publishing, et cetera. And yeah, as Terry notes, the students notice as well, they're getting squeezed into classrooms, they're getting squeezed into dorms that don't get renovated, and then all of these other things get popped into existence with millions and millions of dollars. So I think one of the questions here of like how to visibilize all of this is a question of methodology. And this is one of the things that I did very explicitly in my book. And in all of my work with infrastructures is the choice of starting the analysis from the perspective of marginalized users is what enabled a whole bunch of the insights that I make in the book. If I had written a history of transportation in London, I would have ended up with another tome on the history of transportation in London, of which I read countless. And it would have been the same story, regurgitated and repeated. But because I effectively chose to start my analysis from the perspective of wheelchair users and asking them about their experiences, all of a sudden, all of these other realities about the infrastructure came into being. And in my narrative of the history of transportation, et cetera, only because that was the starting point. And I'm sure that if I had chosen a departing point that was like people with autistic persons, it may have been even a slightly different like version of the story. And I think that that's one of the key points, is that the point of departure of analysis for something like infrastructures seriously matters, seriously matters.
Devin, that strikes me. I'm gonna sort of I'm gonna intervene. One of the things that seems to be emerging here, Devin, your word was purpose. Raquel, one of your big words is sort of user. And Leroy sort of nicely pulled some things in here. I mean, one of the things that I wanted us to talk a little bit about is our different disciplinary backgrounds. That is part of where an analysis starts and part of a habituated mode of seeing. But obviously, I think both of you guys, knowing your work, you have drawn on a wide range of different kinds of work. And both of you have made the point here and to me privately that we need to start doing this work together. That, of course, then means, how do we move from our particular ways of seeing a brick wall or an infrastructure, our particular habituated purposes. John Guillory is a reference for some of us, but not most of us. We have to find ways then, it strikes me, of kind of building up from the bottom these sorts of modes of talking to each other. And I know that's really hard. So I'm wondering, maybe we can start this with you, Devin, and then pass it back. You're writing software in a history department. That's something different. So you got any thoughts there, Devin?
Well, my response to that is really simple and not satisfying, which is that it doesn't matter how you want to talk about it. The starting point, and I completely agree with Raquel that like all of this is determined by where you want to start the discussion. And I mean, the really irritating version of that is called path dependence. People talk about path dependence in all kinds of different contexts. It has a specific mathematical meaning. Like there's all kinds of different ways it comes up. I think Raquel's framing is much better. Entrenchment is the other version of that. Yeah. None of this matters in practice because the thing you have to do is pay for the conversation. Right? What you need is money so that people can do something together. And so that means that what you do in practice, the places that you start in practice, in my mind, basically, whatever ideal world we would like, those starting places are determined by what we can get funded. And so, I have a dying horse that I can keep beating in this conversation about, I would really like people to stop writing books and start spending all of their time just looking for funding for other people. But in my view, the only thing that matters here is figuring out how to make contact with people that have those resources, that have that money, and figure out where those starting places can be that fit in between our purposes and theirs. So that's my very dissatisfying response there.
Well, I don't that's a hill that we're both probably going to die on at some point, but it connects to Leroy's point really in really important ways, I think, ultimately about the recognition of good work and what are the infrastructures that we set up in order for that to occur. And again, I chose the word forced to write a book, again, for very good reasons, right? Those are the structures in place that dictate what a good tenure package looks like. So going up for tenure right now, I'm putting together my package. Number one thing on that list that has been asked of me in no uncertain terms is, when is your book coming out? There is no choice in an STS department, in the vast majority of humanities and social sciences department, that is the litmus test. Much in the same way as there is a singular checkbox for getting your PhD, and that is to write a dissertation, the litmus test for getting tenure ends up being, have you written a book and 6 articles? That's the litmus test in my department. So it's one of the questions that I've asked and got no good answer to is, who said so? Ultimately, and why are we still enforcing that norm? Is that a negotiable standard? And what do we do in cases where so much good work has been done towards educating people, towards ensuring that we have a supportive department in terms of people that are doing service work and administrative work? Like what is the leeway here for recognizing good labor and good work in ways that don't go through the book and the articles? Like, for example, setting something up like this, right? Setting up networks of conversation. How can we find ways of ensuring that our infrastructures of knowledge, to not say knowledge infrastructures, are also recognizing this type of labor and this type of work? I have no good answer for that, unfortunately. It turns out that to do a lot of effective work, you have to have gone through the rigors of the institution and the demands of the institution, because otherwise you are in the type of situation where you were scared of not securing like a stable position. So the only thing that I can do within my department right now, it seems, is raise these flags in these conversations and wait until tenure for me to just become a pain in everybody's ass. So.
Well, what a good pain in the ass you
Well,
are.
just before you jump in, James, like Raquel, I think you know this, but that was not a dig at you. Like, I just want to make that explicit.
Yeah, I
Like,
wanted
I'm not like,
actually-
Raquel, you should not have written your book. Because I very, in my thinking about this, I'm really, and I have been a pain in Leroy's ass about this literally for 10 years, that his job is to find money for other people, and that's his only job. You know, that like, if somebody who's a senior scholar who's been around for a while, the further you get down that road, the less scholarship you should be doing, like ethically, practically, infrastructurally, whatever it is. The only way forward is for those people to stop doing what they consider scholarship and start just doing fundraising, basically, is the, you know, simplest version of that. Yeah.
Get in there, Paul. Yeah, get in there, Paul.
I'm sorry, I have to leave shortly, so I hate doing this, but I really, this has been a fantastic conversation. I won't bore you with my background, but as someone who works in an interdisciplinary department and works with people in lots of different fields, I think, Devin, that point of like the senior scholar as fundraiser makes so much sense in a lot of the hard sciences, and that model already is there, right? Like, you basically have the capo, and from that, the sort of like funding trickles down. I guess the 2 points are, does that reinscribe a kind of political economy, which I think, I'm glad you brought up money, because I do think the political economy and infrastructure questions have to be asked together, but I also think there's a value in disentangling them for analysis. So I think that's one thing I would bring up. The other thing I would bring up to Raquel's point, which I'm all best wishes on your tenure, it sounds like you're going to be a shoo-in, but as a chair who thinks about these things, I think we also have to not just ask, like, why is it this way, but what is the end toward which this infrastructure, if we're going to call like the tenure portfolio, is put together for? And then I guess the last piece of all this is, as much as I'm in favor of thinking about good work and I want to have these kinds of conversations, I I think the wheelchair user in a city's public transit is kind of doing the good work. And part of our job is to like see and articulate and think about those things in different ways. And then the last thing, I go way back, I was really interested in the difference between modeling and describing and an infrastructure that is sort of like built and designed versus a model that's trying to actually make sense of like something out in the wild, to go back to the climate stuff. So like, that's like, I'm just throwing this out there in the hopes that it might be useful for some people, but I am interested in this kind of political economy and money and discipline. Because I guess another way to think about it is that people in the hard sciences I've met tend to think of themselves more like capitalist managers. And I'm not blaming them for that. I feel like that's the way those systems have been set up. Whereas people from like literary studies background have this kind of almost luxury of like denying the fact that they're in that position within certain institutions, because they are working in models where it's like, yeah, you sit around and you write a great book and everybody talks about it, and the New Yorker interviews you for it. That's what you do when you're a senior scholar. So just a few thoughts, and I'll stick around for a few more minutes, but this has been great.
Wait, let me announce really quick. I'm just gonna let this open because clearly that's the energy. So I want you guys to respond to that. But Terry and Eric have asked great questions in chat. And so feel free to just get in now, Terry and Eric, and anybody else.
Can I respond to Paul real quick before others jump in?
Please.
Paul, thank you. Yes, I think the big question around like, yes, what are we changing it? Why, how can we change it? Why should we change it? But really, what is the goal of tenure? I think is something, and I feel like this is another conversation that Devin and I have had about like, what is an alternative to tenure and what would it mean to create alternatives to tenure, given, you know, I don't know, for lack of better words here, the world is imploding. So I don't really like have a good sense of what we are working towards. And maybe, and this, I just read Camus, like the Myth of Sisyphus, and like, maybe the point is just that the struggle is the point. So I don't know, maybe that is the answer at the end of the day. But one of the things that I think is really important to put into conversation with some of this as well is that political economy is repeatedly the thing that wheelchair users will bring up, right? It's like not just political will, it's political economy. There's like a broad understanding, there's a broad understanding that infrastructures are malleable to particular degrees. There are degrees of freedom of what can be accomplished in shift an infrastructure. So in London's public transport system, for example, it's adding a ramp, right? It's adding a ramp to the bus. It's making the buses like low floor access and replacing them over time until literally 100% of the bus fleet in London is wheelchair accessible. That doesn't mean that wheelchair users haven't struggled with wheelchair access. And this is the deep irony, is that even though we want to talk about political will, political economy for changing these things, at the end of the day, even when they change, it doesn't suffice. And I talk about this in the book as designed materiality, as like one of the things that creates perduring, not just material states, but also relational states. So one of the things that ends up happening with buses is parents with strollers now have access to buses much more easily as well, and are now claiming the wheelchair priority access space. And one of the questions that has like ended up as a result of this is like, yeah, why are we surprised that this happened? Just because we're creating the space doesn't mean that all of a sudden years, really centuries of ableism have been undone. Like there is still this feeling that people with children, parents with children ought to have priority over wheelchair users who are, you know, not reproducing and not perhaps, or that are not actually productive citizens or not going to work. And these are like the imaginations that we have. So why should we create space for them and not create space for strollers? So like the material changes don't suffice to change relations. And I think that this is something that ends up getting lost in conversations around infrastructure. And when I think about tenure and when I think about changing the demands of tenure, I also think about that, right? So like, let's say we do change the demands of tenure. What does that mean for Devin's question? What does that mean for what is the role of the senior scholar? It doesn't change that. So that's one of the things that I think we need to keep in mind is like infrastructures aren't just about materiality. They're about what that materiality has inscribed in terms of relations. They're about centuries, decades, whatever, like a long period of time of congealing social relations as well.
Yeah, so I think there's the thing that I would like to say to add to both of those, and thanks, Paul, is that the key feature of a senior scholar, and I take your point about capitalist management, and that I think is totally appropriate. The key thing here is that regardless of the political economy label that you want to put on it, a senior scholar has a network that a dissertating graduate student does not. Right, so they know funders, they have done grant applications, they have had successful whatever, right? I mean, if they've gotten to that point, then they're doing something successful at some point. So they have those experiences and they have those networks, and that is the thing that necessitates that they are using those networks to distribute resources to other people, and not their capitalist sort of apex status. Yeah, and so I think that point about making this about the networks people have access to sort of changes this discussion a little bit. And that issue of a social network then again is also the thing that, so like, for instance, and you know, Oliver Kell's points about ableism are really appropriate, but like there's a question here about like, does a child who uses a stroller have a mobility impairment relative to the infrastructure that we have, right? But Jacob, you've had your hand up unless somebody else wants to jump in here.
Yeah, thanks. So I actually want to, not to digress too far from the point at hand, but to just take it back a little bit to something you said earlier, Devin, about something Leroy, I've had enough conversations with Leroy about this to know that this rings my bell. There's got to be money involved. For there to be an event, somebody has to pay for it, and perhaps even more disconcerting is that for there to be a series of events, you don't need just money, you need a cash flow. And for a cash flow, you have to have some kind of corporate or business infrastructure in place. And I say corporate, I mean that literally, like you have to have a corporate entity in place that has taken all the necessary steps to make sure that your tax status is legitimate also. So it's complicated to just make what in college seems simple, that we would just pop down to, you know, the common area in the dorm and have the conversations that we want to have. So the reason I circle back to that point is because this is something I've been thinking a lot about recently, and that is how do we, because ultimately I think what we have to do is how do we persuade people who have the resources and ability to make something like this happen, like establish a place for scholars who have no particular interest in developing a return on the investment, to just come together and talk about things. How do I convince somebody to move assets, cash, whatever, that could be generating a cash flow for them on the side, and they're going to take those resources and give it to us for us to do what? This comes back to the question that Leroy raised in his spiel earlier, which is it comes down to a question of what does it mean to be doing good work? And to put it a little crassly in these, you know, sort of, I don't know, late capitalistic terms, what is the return that we are offering the people who have the ability to make these things happen? And that's not the language we're accustomed to thinking about these things in. And it doesn't have, but I guess it doesn't have to be a cynical way of looking at it. It doesn't have to be, you know, whose pockets are being lined by what we're doing. It is, you know, to pivot away from cynicism, there are extraordinarily wealthy people in the world who do things, in some cases, just because they like them. not because they're going to make money on the side because they're doing it, but because it's something they genuinely like. Yeah, like here, I live outside of Bentonville, Arkansas. We have a world-class American art museum that is basically a tax write-off for Alice Walton, the heiress of the Walmart fortune. Okay, fine. It's still free. Anybody can go. It's nice. It raises the value of the area. It was a good thing to do. And she really did it, I think, because she wanted to, or so, you know, how do we cultivate, you know, the interests and passions of people who maybe do have an interest in helping us do what we want to do here. And it also comes back to Devin's point about the networks, right? Like people in like Leroy's position can probably find themselves more likely to make a phone call that will be actually answered than someone like, you know, maybe the younger we are and the less distinguished we are, the less likely that phone call gets returned. Anyway, that's just sort of my thoughts. So wrap up.
I'm going to quickly just sneak in here to say two things. The first is, you know, I want to make sure that people who haven't talked before, people who have talked, that seems only fair. And I want to sort of challenge you a bit, Devin. When you say how we talk about it doesn't matter, that may be true, you know, kind of in this circumstance, but it seems it actually really does matter. The vocabulary, the specific kind of metric, right? Like what does good work mean, or what is success, or why should you fund this? These are all richly sort of normative, ethical value arguments. And I think I kind of am trying to poke in a bit here for Terry made a great point about the way spreadsheets kind of model a certain kind of value across a university campus. And so that's just I know you agree with me on some level, Devin, so I'm not trying to, but I'm trying to get Terry in there too. But you don't have to, Terry.
Yeah, I can respond, but Terry, if you want to jump in, go ahead.
Oh yeah, no, thanks for connecting it back. I mean, can you guys hear me okay? I'm in a non-usual environment, so I don't know if this is working well. Yeah, I know we had kind of passed that point, but I was just thinking about the different ways different constituents imagine a resource within an ecosystem, like a college or a university or a larger institution. And the difficulty of not just talking about it in ways that activate the way of imagining what you're building or the kinds of connections you're trying to make with the existing community, like how to get them to imagine it, but also like the difficulty of the resources that you have to expend in order to do so when there's other forces outside of that context that you have no control over and you can't persuade, you can't do anything about, that the spreadsheet lookers have to deal with. You know, and there's just, I don't really know, I haven't really figured out a way to sort of, I don't know if that's intelligible, but like go over that chasm, you know, fight that force, because trying to get some spaces in the college that I teach at where students can collaborate across their art disciplines, and the students want it, the pedagogy of all the faculty that are trying, they want it, but it's hard to make that visible beyond like these really abstract concepts of resources. And then to Leroy's point, buildings, highly visible, highly brochurable, you know, stuff, which may or may not experientially do the sort of good work that we're going for.
Yeah, so I think James's point and exactly what you're saying, Terry, line up when I said it doesn't matter how you want to talk about this, James knows that I didn't mean like you can use whatever language you want. The point is that regardless of how you talk about this, one of the primary constraints on how this comes up and how we make those choices about starting points and analyses has to include exactly what you're talking about spreadsheet lookers, Terry, right? That like we can make whatever arguments we want about what kinds of analysis we should do and what sorts of claims are most appropriate, or what sorts of scholarship need to get done today. But ultimately, there has to be some kind of rubber that meets the road somewhere that says, okay, we are going to do important analysis, and also this is how we're going to get it done. And getting it done means having that budget, having that spreadsheet available and saying, we need 10,000 hours, right? We have to pay someone to use this time to get this analysis done. And so whatever else we have to have the infrastructure to get that person paid for their hours.
Raquel, I saw you.
I just want to add one thing. So one thing that I kind of hope doesn't get lost in the conversation is I take it seriously when I say that I take as a point of departure for analysis marginalized experiences, right? Wheelchair users specifically. But I think it's really important to underline that I'm not trying to valorize that as some kind of like overarching vision. And I think this is really important, because especially when we're talking about spreadsheet lookers, right? As though that were some kind of like eagle's eye that sees all or whatever. And the reason why I want to emphasize that is when I speak of situatedness, I'm talking here about situated knowledge, but importantly, I emphasize that everybody's view is partial and everybody's view is situated. So what I think that why all of this is important in conversations about interdisciplinarity is that we are all being influenced by the genealogies and the baggages that we're going to bring. And as a result, it's in having these types of conversations that I think we can minimize the like ignorant spots that we might have. So I really want to avoid wherever possible, speaking of anybody or any particular position as having like more understanding than any single other position in relation to an infrastructure.
Wonderful.
But what about less? Can they have less understanding?
I don't know. I honestly don't know. I'll be honest with that, because I feel like when it comes down, and I see this, and I think this is useful to talk about, because one of the things that seems to be coming out as like the antagonism is like administrators and faculty, right? And having undergone like 6 years underneath Shirley Ann Jackson at Rensselaer, and I know this is being recorded, I will refrain from saying too many terrible things, but she was a renowned micromanager, right? And it was like, and it created like a really huge rift between how administration sees an institution versus how faculty see an institution. But even then, frankly, it's treating both of these categories as monoliths. Like I have faculty that we do not align on education whatsoever. And we're never going to align on education. And there are administrators that are fighting the good fight alongside me. So I don't know that there's like, I don't know that they know the system less. I don't know that they know the infrastructure less. I think they expect different things from it. I think they build different parts of the infrastructure. They have different techne in relation to the infrastructure than I do, but I don't know that they know it less than I do. So that's an open question for me.
So I think this, I mean, in my mind, what I again sort of am thinking about as both of you are going back and forth on this is again, like we can frame this around networks. That, you know, someone who has $1 billion in their pocket and is going to build a space program or whatever, it's not that they know better how to use that money, but they have a network such that they have access to it in a different way than other people do, right?
But I really need to get into this for a minute.
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay, now, first, let's start on the question of tenure and senior people. Now, most of what is said about this is based on rumor and guess and ignorance. You know, that how it actually works is not how you think it works. You know, and that's a very difficult thing to convey, because it comes out of long periods of time where you recognize that if you raise the question, is something fit for the purpose, it takes a lot of people and a lot of time to recognize when you got the purpose wrong. You know, and if you look at the narrative we have been telling people in undergraduate programs for at least the 50 years that I've been doing this, you know, they're terrible, wretched, misleading stories. It's a narrative that does not work. You know, I will go to undergraduate and be a terrific person in my major, and then I'll get to graduate school, and when 5 years I'll get a PhD, and then 7 years I'll publish my book, and I'll get tenure, and I'll have a professional life. That almost never happens. You know, what happens instead, you know, is that you've recognized that if you do not you know, come to a point where you have a way to assess your own experience in the context where you actually are working, then all of the things that Devin has talked about, you know, it's quite true. But it's not as if, because I know hundreds, possibly thousands of people, I've spent more of the state's money than I even like to think about. And in no case would I say that it was simply something where I knew how to get the money. I knew how to cooperate with the 15 people that it took to make the case. I wrote the documents, you know, where I said, well, how should I go and raise the money? And all of the people in development offices or advancement offices or whatever the hell they call them now, they said the same thing. Don't do that. You don't know how to ask for money. You have nothing to do with the money. You write a document that justifies what it is, tell us what the purpose is, show us in detail how it is its pieces can be put together, and we'll find the money for you. And then, you know, what I've said in conversations with a bunch of you is that, you know, if you're going to raise money, you have to know down to the nickel how you're going to spend it and why, and what effect it is likely to have. You know, and it is not the case that the only people who get reputations and have tenure, you know, have published a singular author book. Me, for example, you know, it's not necessary. You know, it hasn't been necessary for a long time. What is necessary is that you maintain absolute concentration on what does count as good work. If you take things like, how do we actually handle the part of infrastructure that is not immediately visible? Well, it's by making it visible. And Raquel's point and Devin's project on databases with methodology is absolutely crucial to this, because right now, on the question of if you realize that what your work requires in the state of whatever discipline, whatever department you're in, you know, it will require you to know about 5 or 6 other fields. And you can go out there and get the thing that is the most in the news and fail completely to find the interesting work, the work that has practical consequences that you can put on the ground and it'll actually go. You know,
Good. Leroy, I'm going to stop you there so Raquel can respond because she wants to, I can see.
Okay.
I just wanted to get on the point that Leroy was making around, you know, that collaboration aspect, the piece of the puzzle that I think is crucial that a lot of people kind of end up. And I try to, in writing acknowledgements, it was a really interesting experience because acknowledgements are nothing other than the infrastructure that made the book come together and work, right? And this is something that is my new obsession, thanks to James Searle. But thinking about distributed cognition is one of the things that has really helped me in that, is how and I think distributed cognition hit something really core in me, and that's in relation to also Devin's point on the lonely work of historians, is that even work that seems utterly lonely is not done alone. Even the thinking that seems to be done by yourself is never done alone, because even if you only have contact through about the other people's work through their writing, you are thinking with somebody. And that's the only thing that got me through writing a book at all, was the fact that it is in writing a book that I was integrating conversations in a new and novel way. And this is what I'm now saying to my graduate students when they're like struggling to write at all. I was like, your ideas are worth nothing if they're not materialized in some way and if they're not in circulation. If thoughts are thoughts, ideas must be in circulation. And you can circulate that in a variety of ways. It doesn't need to be done in like the more institutionally accepted norms. It can be done like this, but it has to get done. So that's the only thing that I really wanted to speak to in terms of Leroy's remarks, is like so much of the work that we do, including in finding funding, is only successful because we do it collectively and because we have other people that know better in fields that we don't.
Yeah, and so when I'm saying that like senior scholars need to be sort of spending their time finding resources for other people, the point there is that not that individuals will do that. The point is that everyone has to do it so they can fail to do it 100 times and succeed once. And therefore, for a faculty of 6,000 people, you will have 60 successes, right? That this is not a thing that we can do individually. It has to be a cultural shift. And if that cultural shift doesn't happen, as far as I'm concerned, like the history department at the University of Washington, and I am going to say this on a recording, shouldn't exist anymore. It just is not doing something that is of value, that is so substantial that the resources that maintain the history department should stay in that role.
And I think here you've got to, you know, the point earlier about degrees of freedom, and you know, conversations I've been having with a bunch of you about this stuff is, you know, they're only local solutions. It's got to be, culture is a real serious word there, or Terry earlier, yours, ecosystem is a real serious, that those culture shifts and those concerted efforts to rethink our habits, to try as much as we can to resist the grooves in the infrastructure, right? You know, it turns out it really does matter how the hallways on your floor are laid out. And if they're, you know, if that is getting in the way of producing a culture of collaboration, you have to, regardless of your lack of money or whatever else, turn your attention to filling in the gaps a little bit there. I'm having such a great time. I wanted to sort of shout out people who hadn't spoken before. I hate to do it, but I'm going to sort of nudge Joseph Henderson because Joseph is here. I don't know if he can even talk right now. But to Raquel's point about getting ideas out there, Joseph runs a podcast, which I listen to really regularly, and it's kind of an emergent form. So I'm just putting that. I don't even know if Joseph can get on. I just wanted to put that out there, but I wanted to welcome other people who haven't spoken yet. If there's something that's been sort of bubbling up that you want to say, now is the time. Get in there, Joseph.
Yeah, this is, I mean, this is really great because I think that, you know, James, your point about sort of emergent forms, it's really huge. It's interesting too, to me, how there are ways, and there have been various elements of this chat about institutional limits, infrastructural limits, affordances, other things like that, that just speak, I mean, and have spoken so directly and pragmatically to my experiences working in the public library here in South Carolina. And again, I don't know, James, like your point about how the hallways are designed and other stuff like that. I mean, when you're dealing with something, even like the location where I am, where we have like different sets of hierarchies that are kind of operating on us at all time, that sort of organize how people do things in the building, you know, different departments that ostensibly share the same goals and same problems of what we're trying to do for our community, or at least how we're also trying to answer questions about what our community needs. There's still so regularly so many various barriers to working together in different ways, sharing resources, whether those are, you know, whether those are like portable projectors that like one department owns that another department, you know, uses when they're going to, like a bakery in a nearby community where a lot of folks from Ukraine are meeting and are working on their Russian and are also maybe needing to fill out state paperwork. I don't know. This is just like a thing that comes up that comes up twice a month for me, just super locally in my department, where then it becomes a question of, okay, well, what budget line do we need to consider to make sure this new department that is just now coming into being, that focuses on outreach in really specific ways, how do we make sure they have the things that they need? And that's just like one little instance of where these concerns like practically rubber meets road here in the library context. In terms of the podcasting space, I mean, there's so much that's possible there, and so much that I don't know that those kinds of media platforms could afford for more extended conversations in lots of different directions. And whether that's a thing that is taken up by smaller organizations that are looking to have more extended conversations and things like that, whether it's sort of, because James, you and I have talked a little bit about maybe that's like a future direction of putting some of these chats in or whatever, that like it affords another mode of preserving those extended kind of those extended thoughts that aren't maybe making it into publications, that aren't maybe going in more official channels, but still like they need to be out there, they need to be circulating in some kind of way. I feel like I'm going in a bunch of different directions.
You're doing great. I mean, it's one of the things that struck me, it's like, it's easier, for me to have a conversation about literature locally is harder than for me to listen to your book talks. And the fact that right now you're running a reading group on Middlemarch,
right?
That's easier in some way. We know our circumstances. I mean, there are obviously challenges in both ways, but that's happening. I feel so oftentimes that academics need to understand both the problems and the opportunities extend far beyond the campus, and that there are audiences and communities and interested parties that are out there. And so, one of my great interests is getting you more involved so people can understand that in Spartanburg, South Carolina, there are people doing this work. Raquel, you got your hand. Yeah.
I just want to shout out for perhaps James particularly. Albany Public Library has like a whole series of like book reviews that are basically like local people, that some people are like retired historians, local historians that will select a book and like will do a talk on the book where they're ostensibly like reviewing it for people in the audience. And like there's like a whole bunch of little events that the Albany Public Library does as well. And like I say this because I'm also married to a librarian, so of course like I am a staunch defender of public libraries in general, so I'll always plug an opportunity. But actually Joseph's, I'm gonna like do acid jazz free improv right now to like Joseph's response a little bit. But one of the things that really stuck out is like this question of resource sharing and like that type of work that kind of goes against the grooves of the infrastructure, right? So like we'd want to create this neat little budget line that will account for X. We all know that what actually gets in that budget line for X ends up being a whole bunch of other things that aren't necessarily X, that are other ways that people navigate the structures that are dictated by an infrastructure. And this kind of leads me how I've seen wheelchair users do this. Like the the informal networks of knowledge sharing that wheelchair users told me about, like Twitter accounts, blogs, informal like chats with friends, like whatever it is, like that type of information sharing has been so important for actually enabling access in public transportation in London that it has effectively created new ramps for public transportation in London. It has created new signposting and new like adverts on London public transportation. And all of this is because of the work that wheelchair users have done in sharing in what are ostensibly informal networks. They've also obviously organized in like activist groups, but this type of, and in the book, I call this belligerent techne, that are literally techne or practices that go against the grooves of an infrastructure and the prescribed ways of interacting with an infrastructure. They're like molding the network all the time. And this is one of the key stories that I think is a takeaway for today as well, is like, yes, infrastructures feel hegemonic. They feel in a whole bunch of ways like they're stifling, like they're demanding particular ways of acting and interacting. But we do subversive acts of infrastructuring every single day. Like a day where I choose to not check my emails and a day where I tell my students, I don't check emails on the weekend, don't even try, is itself an act against a whole bunch of institutional norms. And I take that really seriously as like, yep, these are small ways of change. And if everybody accepts that and everybody starts talking about it more openly, more people start doing it, it becomes the new infrastructure. But that's the only way that we get there, is through these gradual acts of change.
You're muted, Devin.
Yeah, so I think this point about resource sharing and that extends, you know, to knowledge about where to get things and how to get access to things is really, really important, because again, coming back to this thing about like senior scholars being sort of like capitalist managers in some sense, there's another way to view this as people that have enough institutional knowledge to know like whose closet that projector is sitting in, right? That like I started working at a lab here at the University of Washington campus that is an accelerator setup it's a commercial accelerator that was purchased in the 60s. The lab is organized around this, and there's some other projects there too, but it's this big concrete bunker that's got different sections in it that's built around this commercial particle accelerator. There's all kinds of institutional history here, but the state it was in when I came in was that there had been this massive expansion, or this thing that basically doubled the size of the facility with these superconducting elements, that then got decommissioned because nobody was doing that kind of science anymore. And so the state that was in when I got there was such that anytime you wanted to do something new, what you would do would be to go cannibalize the LINAC. So you would go and take all those pieces apart and start using them for something else. And that's a really sort of specific example here. But the point is that when you have people who have been around long enough, they are the folks that can then also say, you know, nobody's doing this anymore, we might as well dismantle it, right? So the end of life of these things is one of the most important aspects of understanding how you might make some of these cultural changes. Because, you know, infrastructures are embedded in blah, 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 but there's also stuff in there somewhere. And when people stop using it, you can do something else with it.
Beautiful point.
Obsession. This is my new obsession. Thank you. So my next research project is on the telescope in Arecibo, Puerto Rico. And it collapsed in 2020. And it's a fascinating history of like the lifespan of research infrastructures. And nobody knows where it's going next. And one of the things that I have found is in a 2006 senior review by the Division of Astronomical Sciences by the NSF, they explicitly say that among the things that they just don't know is how to account for the economy of life cycles of infrastructures, right? So here they're talking about specifically the money of maintaining an infrastructure and then the eventual decommissioning of an infrastructure. And this is something that nobody has really written about. I mean, people talk about the infrastructures in states of ruins or of renation or states of disrepair or whatever. But frankly, a lot of that is fine. I'll be controversial. A lot of it is kind of shite, and some of it is just kind of like pure, like anthropologists just kind of having a good time with talking about like modern ruins. And it's fine, but most of it isn't really contending with how we got there. What do we do with the end of life of these things? What does it mean to take over an infrastructure for one purpose and make it for something else? What are the constraints and affordances of that specifically? Like, how the hell do you take a telescope that's 165 meters wide and just transform those facilities into something else? It's in the middle of the mountains of Puerto Rico, you know? It's like a really big question, literally a really big question of what the hell to do with what's left over. And it has like ecological impact, it has significant community impact because of people who work in Arecibo. So it's just like, yeah, nobody is really doing scholarship on it very well. And I think that that's a huge question. End of life cycles and transition of life cycles of infrastructures.
Yeah, so there's two things. One is an anecdote, and Jens, if you ever see this, I'm maybe completely misinterpreting your response to this. But when I first got back from an internship and started working in Vancouver, my immediate supervisor, Jens Stilling, he at the time ran what was called a Titan group at Triumph. It was this specific mass measurement facility. They had like a bunch of world-class instruments there. They were one of 3 or 4 groups that do what they do. And I asked him, we were just sort of out for coffee. I asked him, like, Jens, how do you know when Titan is done? Like, how do you know when to roll this thing up? And there was basically not, like, it felt to me as though he hadn't really thought about, or certainly no one had asked him this directly. And this is something that I have thought of specifically because I came from this lab that was 50 years old, and we were in the process of moving all this stuff around and repurposing things all the time, that I was curious about. That, like, if you are the person who initiated this project, you built this like tens of millions of dollar facility, like, what does it look like when you start to do something else? Like, how do you know when your life cycle for a project like that is maybe coming to an end, or when it transitions? The other thing is Fermilab is the largest accelerator in the United States. There's a bunch of very interesting stories about the superconducting super collider, which was a potential system that was going to replace Fermilab, and that was funded in the Clinton administration, and then that all collapsed, and they moved over to CERN, to supporting CERN in Geneva, and the Large Hadron Collider. But I recently found out, Fermilab was going through this identity crisis when I was sort of finishing up my undergrad, because LHC, was the Large Hadron Collider in Europe, was coming online, which is bigger than Fermilab. It does the same stuff, so it's bigger. And the way that physics works is that if you've got a bigger facility, you can just do more physics, and so Fermilab in many ways becomes redundant and less useful as soon as something bigger comes online. And I was recently going back over this for some other reason through like the stuff that Fermilab has been doing in the last 10 years. And they seem to have done this, to have actually managed this transition into like, okay, we had all these knockdown drag out fights about whether we were going to do a muon factory, or we going to do, sort of axion searches, or we going to do all these different things. And people found what science cases they're going to do. And there's always these acrimonious, like awful arguments that happen that, people lose friendships and collaborations and all these things, but they are doing new science, and they're doing it actively, and they maintain these collaborations. And what they did was pivot to different things, but the lab is still there. They're still doing cool stuff. And that is one of those moments where there was this very sharp, like, this is the end of your cutting edge life.
Well, good. I'm going to make a comment before sort of asking if there are any last people. We're running out of time here. The comment is partially how great it is, that how just exciting the conversation is, and then a bit of an observation, which is that it is remarkable that it is not standard practice to walk into a department or a program and learn its history. that is something that has always struck me as strange. And the minute you learn the history of your place, things make sense, opportunities emerge, you understand people's behavior, even if it is an old acrimonious civil war or a failed program of re-education or whatever, that those are things we can do within the existing things, right? That can start to make a difference. And I think, you know, to your point, Devin, seeing ourselves in that way would lead towards that massive attempt at seeing ourselves as part of projects that need funding, that need to be taken care of, that have historical trajectories and changing responsibilities. It would introduce a sort of set of dynamism. But so long as we all just say, I'm here till I get to the next thing, or my research is the only thing that matters, right? That part of what we're getting towards, which is great, is this notion of a meeting place, that people have to get together in a room or in a Zoom room and have these kinds of conversations. Now, Leroy has his hand up, but before he's going to get in, I have to make space. Richard, please go ahead.
Hi, I don't have a lot to say, but like I'm a PhD student in comparative literature at University of Washington. I'm trying to finish my interminable dissertation, and I thank you all for great conversation, and it's giving me a lot to think about, because like I'm trying to kind of answer the question of how can we communicate like the scale of climate change, and like what is needed to address it at scale, you know. So it seems like I really agree with Mikhail that like or with who I guess, you know, that like a part of this is just you'll struggle, but like I'm wondering how these kind of local project, local engagement and like finding funding for projects work out in like when we are facing this existential risk that's like, well, that needs an immediate response, and we're not having it.
That's a great question. Feel free.
So I mean, this idea that there's sort of this cliff, I think, is something that I spend a lot of time thinking about, because especially if you look at, like, you know, one of the big reasons why all of the stuff that we're doing, that we're talking about, seems to line up better somehow in the sciences is simply because the university system and the business environment was structured around scientific stuff after World War II, right? That like all of this is structured this way specifically because scientific innovation was the thing that the US federal government decided would structure all of their decisions for a while going into the Cold War, right? And in those moments, people did have these very apocalyptic views about, like, there is creeping socialism everywhere. We are going to blow ourselves up with nuclear weapons. But now we're in a situation where it doesn't matter what choices people make at this point. There's no decision about how bad it's going to get, right? It could be worse than it's going to become, but we know at this point that all of the most catastrophic scenarios for climate change that we understood 10 years ago are tame compared to what's going to happen in the next 50 years. So I don't have a good response to that, but I think about this all the time too, about the fact that like we're doing all of these sort of incremental kind of nibbling around the edges of these things, but like all of this sort of big world change rhetoric that's been around forever is coming due now in a way that it hasn't in the past. And you know, I'm totally sympathetic.
Yeah, Raquel, you got anything on that?
I'll just say that the question of like how to contend with scales of climate change is something that I've seen a lot of people think about, and a lot of it in artistic practices. We have a grad student in the arts right now, Ali Wist, who is working exactly on the question of like how to create affects of climate change, like how do you in like a phenomenology of climate change. And that's something that she's really interested in. But I don't have a good answer, unfortunately. It's one of those things where contending, I think it's just reached the point where it's so much easier to joke about it flippantly, right? And just kind of do what I did. That was like, seems like everything's kind of blowing up around us and collapsing around us, and everybody just kind of has a chuckle about it. And it's like, yeah, because effective, and I wonder to what extent this doesn't connect with, and Leroy may want to jump in on this, exactly with the question of visibility. And how do we make these structures and infrastructures visible? Because one of the things that I have found to be true, and at least in part, is like we have stats like individual behavior changes around, say, becoming a vegetarian or using LED lights at home are a drop in the bucket compared to industrial practices of fishing, of pollution around cement and concrete, the things that are making up our infrastructures all the time. So I don't know how to have that conversation at the level of policymakers. This is part of the reason why I kind of want to shift gears to infrastructures of research, because I actually think that in that space, I'm more comfortably poised to start having conversations around how to do science funding. And that's for me like a baby step towards having some of those conversations. And then who knows, maybe I can have with that kind of case study, can then learn how to have better conversations around how to affect change really at the upper level.
Beautiful. Christina, I saw that camera come on. I don't know if you were gonna, but feel free if you were.
No, it was just I was in a place where I really couldn't keep my camera on without like causing a disruption. So I just wanted to make sure that I did before we ended, and I've really enjoyed the talk and the conversation.
Good, cool. Well, Leroy, I think with that you can get your last little bit in before we wrap this up.
Oh, okay, well, I want to go back to a couple of points. One that you made, James, that it's not standard practice for people to look at the history of their institution. I've written about this. It's a characteristic problem that you don't know why it is people are doing what they're doing. And we end up with peculiarities where the question of how do we discern what counts as good work, is really deeply connected to how well do we understand the history that got us where we are. And then to look at it and say, how many resources are there available, which are now either no longer resources or things that have to be moved out of the way, and it becomes a very serious question of practicality, because we don't need to build the gigantic buildings, and we don't need to have many more classrooms, because there are all sorts of things that are now possible to do, like this meeting. Now I just wanted to say directly, your work in setting this up, getting these 3 conversations going, is really significant. And the question is, do we understand what the practical implications might be? The fact that in many cases, where if we're going to do something that's fit to the purpose, the way you clarify the purpose is partly by looking at the tools you have available. Now, I want to throw something back to Devin, and this is perhaps unfair, but one of the remarkable things about this project that he's working on, is that this is not an ordinary database. This is something that is, I find it extraordinarily exciting. I've worked on databases. I know what the hell that involves. This is something that moves in a way of changing the ontology, of what a database is, going away from a concern with objects to a question of edges. And the kind of intellectual work that's necessary to get that articulated, is not just the writing of the code, but also realizing that if you want to bring yourself up to speed to say, I need to know something about microbiology, where the hell will I go? And you end up with people taking things out of Twitter accounts, or bad journalism or competent journalism that doesn't get to the interesting question. It's not practical. I think what we're doing here is something that does have practical implications. And part of it is not to rush, but to recognize that how we've fit what we're doing to a purpose we're trying to accomplish is something that requires a lot of conversation. It requires a lot of patience, and it does require, as Devin has been insisting absolutely rightly, a lot of resources. But sometimes the difference between being able to get some implemented is not that you have to build a $10 million particle accelerator. Sometimes it's simply to say, get the agreement of the right 20 people, who will say, this is a thing that we want to include in our syllabi. This is what we want to include in our department meetings. We want to recognize that we cannot continue to operate where university departments are part of what is collapsing, because they're trying to handle the intellectual questions of how you deal with complex, sophisticated understandings, and a gigantic labor question where we've got people who should be being paid, they're not being paid. The jobs are there to be done, and nobody has structured it so that the university can say, this is how we take this segment of the budget and direct it to something else. And it's easy to get very discouraged. But on the other hand, that's a sure way to have the disasters that are coming be even worse than Devin might imagine them to be. So good work. Good work. Let's keep it up.
That's excellent. I think we're gonna wrap it there. I thank Devin and Raquel so much. Is just a great conversation. All the participants, people trickling in and out, that was great. Come listen to Christina talk with Jackie S. on the 28th of April. On April 14th, we're gonna have more conversations. And yeah, thanks all so much for showing up and contributing. Just a great conversation, a really nice way to end a week. So thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, James, for organizing.
Yeah, thanks, James. This is really great.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
All right.
Why
Now
don't we
get out of here.
Can we have these conversations in the department?
Yeah, all right. Yeah, I would love to.
What are we doing?
Do you have me over for tea?
What's
Yeah,
that?
we just need to get a regular barbecue going now that the weather's nice, and pile in so people know, just show up,
Isn't that why you bought a house?
That's it. There we go.
Yeah.
I'll bring that dog too,
I will.
Yeah, good. Okay, everybody. Well, thank you
Take
so
care.
much.
Thanks.
Take care,
Bye-bye.
everybody. Bye.